Have you ever been absolutely certain about something from your childhood, only to discover that your memory was completely wrong? Not just slightly off, but fundamentally different from reality itself. That moment when you realize the world remembers something entirely different than you do. This isn't about forgetting a name or mixing up dates. This is about discovering that your most vivid memories never actually happened. I thought I was losing my mind when it first started. It began with something so simple, so innocent, that I almost dismissed it entirely. The Berenstain Bears. You know those childhood books with the friendly bear family? I would have sworn on my life that they were called the Berenstain Bears. Berenstein. I could see the spelling clearly in my mind, could remember tracing those letters with my finger as a child. But when I looked them up online, every single book, every website, every official source spelled it Berenstain. Berenstein. Not a single trace of the spelling I remembered existed anywhere. My sister laughed when I brought it up, insisting it had always been Berenstain. My mother pulled out an old book from storage, and there it was, clear as day. Berenstain Bears. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe I had just misremembered. Maybe as a child I had read it wrong and the incorrect spelling stuck in my head for decades. But something felt deeply wrong about that explanation. The memory was too clear, too specific, too certain. That's when I discovered I wasn't alone. Forums, discussion boards, and comment sections were filled with people experiencing the exact same thing. Thousands of them, all absolutely convinced that the books had been spelled Berenstain. We couldn't all be misremembering the same thing in the same way, could we? The more I researched, the more examples I found. Do you remember the famous Queen song, "We Are the Champions"? Sing the ending in your head right now. I guarantee most of you just sang "of the world" at the end. But if you listen to the actual recording, those words aren't there. The song ends abruptly after "We Are the Champions." That's it. No "of the world." I played it for friends, and every single one of them was shocked. They all remembered those final words, could hear them clearly in their memory, but the recording told a different story. How do millions of people collectively remember lyrics that apparently never existed? Then there was the Monopoly man. You know, the wealthy gentleman with the top hat and mustache from the board game. Picture him in your mind right now. Is he wearing a monocle? Most people would say yes, absolutely. The image of him with that single eyeglass is burned into our collective memory. Except he never had one. Not in any official Monopoly artwork, not on any board, not anywhere. Yet somehow we all remember it. Each discovery felt like a small earthquake in my understanding of reality. These weren't obscure details or minor discrepancies. These were major cultural touchstones, things millions of people had experienced and remembered. How could we all be wrong about the same things? The term for this phenomenon is the Mandela effect, named after the collective false memory many people have of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, when he actually lived until 2013. But knowing the name didn't make it any less unsettling. If anything, learning that this was a recognized phenomenon made it more disturbing. I started keeping a list. Every false memory I discovered. Every detail that didn't match my recollection. Every moment when reality seemed to shift beneath my feet. The list grew longer each day. Movie quotes I could recite perfectly that apparently had never been spoken. Brand logos that looked completely different than I remembered. Historical events that unfolded differently than my memory insisted they had. The most chilling realization came when I started asking people around me about these memories. Family members, co-workers, strangers online. Time and time again, I found people who shared these same false memories. We couldn't all be making the same mistakes. We couldn't all be misremembering in identical ways. Something was happening to our reality, or to our perception of it. Either human memory was far more flawed than we ever imagined, or something else was at work. Something that could rewrite the past and leave only traces in our minds as evidence of what used to be. The question that haunted me wasn't whether these memories were real. The question was why so many of us shared the same impossible recollections. And more importantly, what else might be different from what we remember? Are you ready to question everything you think you know? Because once you start seeing these changes, you can't unsee them. And you might discover that your own memories are not as reliable as you once believed. What if the past itself is being rewritten, and we're the only ones left who remember how things used to be? What happens when you realize that your childhood memories might be more accurate than documented history? The deeper I dove into the Mandela effect, the more disturbing the discoveries became. This wasn't just about misremembering cartoon spellings or song lyrics anymore. This was about fundamental aspects of reality that seemed to have changed while we weren't looking. I decided to conduct my own experiment. I gathered 10 friends and family members, people I'd known for years, people whose intelligence and memory I trusted completely. Without explaining why, I asked them simple questions about things we'd all experienced together. The results were more unsettling than I'd anticipated. When I asked about the famous line from Star Wars, 9 out of 10 people immediately quoted, "Luke, I am your father." They said it with complete confidence, some even imitating Darth Vader's distinctive breathing. But if you watch the actual scene, Vader never says Luke. He says, "No, I am your father." The word Luke simply isn't there, has never been there, yet virtually everyone remembers it that way. My sister laughed and said I was being ridiculous until I played the clip. The color drained from her face as she listened to the actual dialogue. She stared at the screen in genuine confusion and whispered, "That's not right. That's not how it goes." But there it was, official and unchangeable, proving her memory wrong. Then I showed them the map. I pulled up a current world map and asked them to point out where they remembered Australia being located. Every single person placed it much further south than it actually appears now. They remembered it being more isolated, floating alone in the Southern Ocean, not sitting relatively close to other land masses as current maps show. The same thing happened with South America. Everyone remembered it being directly below North America, but on current maps, it's positioned much further to the east. These weren't minor geographical details. These were entire continents that seemed to have shifted position while we were living our lives, completely unaware. But the most disturbing discoveries came when I started researching historical events that I thought I knew by heart. Do you remember learning about the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989? Specifically, do you remember what happened to the man who stood in front of the tank? Most people have a very clear memory of that protester being run over, crushed by the advancing tank in full view of the cameras. I certainly remembered it that way. The image was seared into my memory as a symbol of oppressive government brutality. But when I looked up the actual footage, the tank stops. The man climbs onto the tank, has what appears to be a conversation with someone inside, then climbs down and walks away. He simply disappears into the crowd, unharmed. The iconic moment of state violence I remembered had never actually been recorded. This pattern repeated itself over and over. Major historical events, cultural touchstones, even basic anatomy seemed to have changed. I discovered that the human heart is not located on the left side of the chest, as I'd always believed, but in the center. The human body supposedly has 24 ribs, not the 22 I remembered learning in school. These weren't obscure medical details, but fundamental facts about our own bodies. I started interviewing people of different ages, from different countries, with different educational backgrounds. A retired teacher in her 70s insisted that she'd taught students for decades about the heart being on the left side. A doctor in his 50s questioned his own medical training when I showed him current anatomical charts. Young people seemed less affected, but anyone over 30 had vivid memories that contradicted current reality. The most chilling conversation I had was with my old geography teacher, Mrs. Henderson. She'd been teaching for 40 years before retiring, and when I mentioned the continental positions, her face went pale. She pulled out her old teaching materials, atlases from the 1980s and 1990s that she'd kept as souvenirs. We sat together, comparing her vintage maps to current online versions. The differences were undeniable, but what shook her most was looking at her own handwritten lesson plans. Notes she'd made years ago about teaching continental drift and plate tectonics suddenly made no sense with the current positioning of the land masses. It was as if someone had quietly rewritten geography while leaving fragments of the old version scattered in people's memories and personal collections. That's when I encountered the term residue. These are traces of the old reality that somehow escaped whatever process changed everything else. Old newspaper clippings, personal photographs, handwritten notes, vintage merchandise, physical evidence that seemed to support our false memories, suggesting that maybe they weren't false at all. I found a newspaper from 1990 with a headline about the Berenstain Bears, spelling it exactly as millions of people remembered. I discovered old VHS covers of movies with quotes that no longer exist in the films themselves. Personal photographs that showed geographical features which current maps insist were never there. Each piece of residue felt like a small victory, proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But it also raised more disturbing questions. If our memories were correct and these traces of evidence existed, what force was powerful enough to rewrite reality on such a massive scale? And why were only some people noticing the changes? The scientific explanations felt inadequate. Mass false memory syndrome couldn't account for the residual evidence. Parallel universe theory sounded like science fiction, but it was starting to make more sense than the alternatives. Were we witnessing the merger of different realities? Had some cosmic event shifted us into a slightly different version of our world? As I compiled more examples, I realized that the changes seemed to be accelerating. Things that had been stable for decades were suddenly different. Brand logos I'd seen thousands of times had subtle alterations. Movie scenes I could recite from memory had been edited. Even recent history was shifting, creating new discrepancies with each passing month. The most disturbing realization was that if reality could change this much without most people noticing, how could we trust anything? How many times had the world been quietly rewritten around us? How much of what we considered solid, unchangeable fact was actually fluid and malleable? Standing at the edge of this abyss of uncertainty, I had to ask myself, are we living in the same reality we were born into? Or have we been slowly, invisibly transported into a world that only resembles the one we remember? The answers I was finding suggested something far more unsettling than simple memory errors. They pointed toward a reality that was not nearly as stable as we'd always assumed.